January of 1942 arrived not with gunfire on European soil, but with the low murmur of voices inside a windowless conference room in Washington, District of Columbia. Outside, the winter wind scraped along the stone facades of the War Department building, but inside, men in pressed uniforms leaned over maps that stretched from Liverpool to Leningrad, from Casablanca to Khabarovsk. Somewhere in the middle of the room stood Lieutenant General Brehon Burke Somervell, commander of the Army Service Forces, a man whose face carried the expression of a banker preparing to stake an empire on a single wager. The subject was not heroism, it was not tactics, it was not courage, it was supply. Somervell cleared his throat, his voice carrying the quiet finality of a man who had already decided the future. "We do not plan to match the enemy," he said. "We plan to drown him, ship everything, everywhere, all the time." A few pencils froze mid-stroke, colonels exchanged glances. A major from the Quartermaster Corps whispered to his neighbour, "He's lost his senses." Another officer, more dryly, scribbled in the margin of his briefing folder a phrase that would circulate through the building within hours. Somervell's Casino. That label, half joke and half warning, captured exactly how the proposal was received. The doctrine did not rely on careful forecasting, nor on precise estimation of battlefield needs. It rejected the traditional logic of military economy. Instead, it embraced something closer to pure audacity, a deliberate willingness to overproduce, overship, and overwhelm uncertainty through sheer volume. To seasoned military logisticians raised on the tight resource logic of European warfare, it looked like insanity. The proposed strategy called for shipping equipment to theatres not yet secured, stockpiling artillery shells without knowing which guns would fire them, sending rations months in advance of operations not yet approved. It was, in every conventional understanding, gambling. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh began turning out materiel at a pace that exceeded even optimistic projections. Trucks rolled off assembly lines without confirmed destinations. Crates of boots crossed the Atlantic before the units that would wear them had landed. Ammunition dumps swelled with shell calibers not yet assigned to any front-line formation. The gamble rested on a single, radical belief that American industrial capacity could outrun German destruction faster than German planners could comprehend. Instead of estimating how many trucks might survive a campaign, the army ordered more trucks than any campaign could reasonably consume. Instead of calculating the precise rations needed for each division, they shipped surplus by the trainload. Supply officers were instructed to think not in terms of conservation, but abundance. Redundancy became policy, buffer became doctrine, excess became armor. Observers, hardened by rationing and constrained production, watched with rising disbelief. At a joint planning session in London, one senior British officer muttered, "They treat supplies like poker chips." The metaphor was not wrong. American planners spoke of probability, tolerance, and margin. They created mathematical models that accepted waste as a necessary cost of certainty. Cargo lost to storms was not failure, it was statistical noise. Spoiled rations were not scandal, they were collateral insurance. The language of war subtly shifted into the language of risk management. Yet in those early months, the gamble looked less like genius and more like chaos. Ships clogged East Coast harbors, their holds packed with mismatched equipment. Crates of winter gear arrived in tropical staging points. Ammunition stacks grew with calibers that no nearby unit could fire. Entire shipments of canned meat spoiled after weeks trapped in overheated holds. Reports circulated of infantry, divisions receiving spare parts for vehicles they did not possess, while armoured battalions waited for components that existed somewhere at sea, but not yet where they were needed. The critics grew louder. "This is logistical intoxication," one British liaison officer complained in a confidential message to Whitehall. "They believe volume alone replaces intelligence." But Somervell remained unmoved. He understood something that few others grasped so early. War in the modern age was no longer fought only by divisions and battalions. It was fought by steel mills, oil refineries, packing plants, and rail systems. The side that controlled the deeper well would not need perfect efficiency. It only needed relentless forward motion. And so the gamble hardened into doctrine. The Army Service Forces formalized a principle so audacious it bordered on heresy: overwhelm uncertainty with volume. When unsure, send more. When doubting timing, double it. When encountering resistance, saturate. Instead of asking what was needed, planners asked what could possibly be needed, and then doubled that figure for safety. Contracts flowed to private industry at unprecedented scales. Civilian manufacturing converted overnight. Assembly line foremen who had once produced washing machines now overseen the fabrication of half-track transmissions. By mid-1942, American production no longer followed demand. Demand followed production. Cargo ships left American ports not fully scheduled but loaded with potential. Commanders in Britain, North Africa, and eventually France found themselves buried under resources they had not requested, but which soon proved invaluable. The supply system ceased reacting to the battlefield. It began anticipating it. What critics had called recklessness revealed itself as preemption. German intelligence, observing sporadic shipping patterns and port congestion, misread the situation entirely. They concluded the Americans lacked discipline. They interpreted the apparent chaos as evidence of inexperience. Reports filtered into Berlin describing poor distribution planning and inefficient coordination. The reality was exactly the opposite. The Americans were not inefficient. They were overwhelming the concept of efficiency itself. Early on, the price of the gamble remained visible. Ports bottlenecked. Warehouses overflowed. Officers argued bitterly over priority lists that shifted faster than teletypes could update. Yet, each mistake carried within it a brutal lesson, and the system learned with mechanical speed. By the end of the year, the outlines of the new doctrine stood clear. The Americans were not aiming for balance. They were aiming for dominance so vast that balance became irrelevant. A captain in the Transportation Corps wrote in his diary, "We do not move supplies to fight battles. We move supplies so that battles become inevitable." Across the Atlantic, German planners still calculated through the pointed, narrow lens of scarcity. Their logistics officers trimmed projections to conserve fuel. They measured risk in rationed gallons and allotted railcars. Their supply system functioned as a precision machine. The American system functioned as an avalanche. And avalanches do not negotiate with terrain. They do not adapt with elegance. They simply bury opposition beneath weight. In January of 1942, when Somervell spoke his now infamous decree, few realized what had been set in motion. It was not merely a supply policy. It was the transformation of warfare into an industrial probability contest, a world where victory would not favor the more careful planner, but the side able to tolerate mistakes without consequence. The gamble had begun. And once the dice left Somervell's hand, they did not stop rolling until Europe itself lay buried beneath the arithmetic of American abundance. By the spring of 1942, Somervell's gamble had passed the point of theoretical bravado and entered the realm of irreversible momentum. The docks of New York, Hampton Roads, and New Orleans no longer resembled ports so much as mechanical organisms, pulsing with cranes, whistles, and the clatter of steel on steel. Liberty ships slid into the Atlantic like stamped coins, each hull a physical expression of the same doctrine: send more than is necessary, because necessity cannot be predicted. Inside the Army Service Forces headquarters, the word sufficiency vanished from briefing documents. It was replaced by phrases such as strategic saturation, forward blanket coverage, and redundancy tolerance. The seat of American logistics had begun to speak a new language, one that rejected caution in favor of volume so overwhelming that failure itself became inconsequential. A newly issued directive dated March of 1942 summarized the strategy with unsettling clarity. Anticipate total loss and ship as if loss does not matter. To any observer trained in traditional military planning, this was madness. Loss had always mattered. Loss defined limits. Loss shaped caution. But American planners now treated loss as a rounding error in a far larger equation. Rail lines across the continental United States became arteries of a war machine never before witnessed. Freight trains extended beyond visual horizon, loaded with trucks still warm from Midwestern assembly lines, artillery barrels greased for seas they had not yet seen, and ration crates stacked with a monotony that bordered on surreal. Oak crates marked for France, Iceland, West Africa, and undefined theatre rolled past each other in endless procession. Undefined theatre was not a joke. It was a deliberate category. It meant supplies whose destination would be decided later, wherever need erupted first. It was inventory designed to exist ahead of geography. Where German logistics responded to crisis, American logistics attempted to erase crisis altogether. British officers watching this unfold began to express private alarm. General Sir Alan Brooke recorded in a confidential memorandum, "The Americans conduct supply as if abundance itself were a weapon." He was correct. They had discovered that uncertainty could not penetrate a wall that thick. Yet, while production soared, the field still struggled with coordination. In North Africa, American units arriving under Operation Torch found depots stacked with winter clothing unsuitable for desert heat. Engineers awaited spare parts that sat in warehouses 300 miles away because of mismatched coding systems. Forward commanders complained of having too much and too little at the same time. A colonel from the 2nd Armored Division summarized the paradox bitterly. "We are drowning in supplies, but always thirsty for the right ones." And yet, the miracle was not precision. It was resilience. Because unlike every army before it, the American system did not collapse under inefficiency. It absorbed it. Each error triggered procedural evolution. Indexing systems refined. Routing algorithms adjusted. Color-coded manifests simplified the madness. Within months, the disjointed flood became something almost smooth. Chaotic abundance began to resemble controlled excess. German reconnaissance could observe the growing port congestion in Britain. They noted the constant arrival of shipping, the construction of new storage facilities, the expansion of supply depots into the English countryside. Yet their interpretation remained flawed. They believed the congestion signaled vulnerability. They assumed this mountain of equipment represented fragility, not strength. A captured German intelligence summary from late 1942 claimed, "American supply inefficiency presents an opportunity. Their chaos indicates structural immaturity." It failed to grasp the core truth. This was not chaos, it was pressure that never released. In the English counties surrounding Liverpool and Bristol, farmland transformed into metallic seas of trucks, fuel cans, artillery shells, rations, tires, engine blocks, bridging segments, and unidentified crates awaiting operational purpose. Villagers watched the landscape change texture. Fields once green turned grey with steel. Roads sank under the weight of traffic that never paused. American drivers rotated in shifts that blurred day from night. Gasoline burned at volumes that would have horrified any European planner. Maintenance crews worked not to conserve vehicles, but to keep them rotating at all cost. Repairs were immediate, replacements constant. The system refused stagnation. A lieutenant assigned to a newly established supply hub near Southampton wrote home, "We are not preparing for war. We are preparing to erase obstacles." That single sentence captured what the High Command would later understand with chilling clarity. This was not logistics as support. This was logistics as offense. Every miscalculated shipment, every misdirected convoy, every spoiled ration was not evidence of weakness. It was the unavoidable friction of scale unprecedented in human history. Where German strategy sought perfection, American strategy accepted imperfection as tribute to dominance. By the end of 1942, Somervell's directive had ceased to be controversial. The results were undeniable. American forces deployed with material superiority so pronounced that tactical setbacks rarely threatened operational stability. Units lost trucks and received replacements before reports were fully filed. Ammunition shortages were corrected within days instead of weeks. Field commanders no longer feared scarcity, they feared congestion. A new term began circulating among senior officers: logistical inevitability. It meant that once American forces entered a theater, time itself favored them. The clock no longer measured endurance, but accumulation. And across the Channel, German officers began to notice something unsettling. Whenever their forces destroyed American materiel, more appeared. When they disrupted convoys, new routes emerged. When they bombed rail junctions, repairs unfolded with unnerving speed. They were fighting a system that did not bleed. And in that realization lay the earliest cracks of understanding. The war was no longer a contest of maneuver. It had become a confrontation between limitation and abundance. The avalanche Somervell had envisioned was moving, and when it finally reached continental Europe, it would not advance by inches or yards. It would advance by weight relentless, implacable, and mathematically impossible to resist. By the early summer of 1943, the full shape of the American gamble had become visible not only to its architects, but to its adversaries. The doctrine born in Washington no longer lived in memo form or theoretical planning. It now rolled across oceans in articulated steel, stacked in British hedgerows, and hummed day and night through a network of warehouses that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the southern coast of England. What had once appeared reckless now revealed a deeper logic. The Americans had transformed uncertainty into a measurable variable. Where other armies calculated risk as a liability, they reframed it as a condition to be absorbed by scale. This was not merely production, it was multiplication. The British rail network groaned under the flow. Sidings filled beyond design capacity. Temporary depots sprawled across villages and pastures. Entire counties became nothing more than silent staging grounds for distant violence. Rows of vehicles extended beyond sight, each bearing markings that indicated destinations not yet finalized, numbered units not yet assigned, missions not yet conceived. And yet the flow never slowed. Somervell's system had matured into something self-sustaining. The factories did not wait for requests. They anticipated them. The ports did not question volume. They adapted to it. The quartermasters no longer debated whether something was needed. They prepared as though every future battle had already demanded it. A British supply officer near Portsmouth described the scene with stunned restraint. It is not an army preparing to advance. It is an entire civilization mobilizing without hesitation. This was the decisive difference. Germany supplied armies. America supplied inevitability. The most telling transformation occurred not at the front lines, but in the psychology of American commanders. Where previous generations feared overextension, the new commanders planned with deliberate excess. Maps were no longer annotated with minimum requirements, but with aggressive assumptions. Everything factored the presence of overwhelming logistical safety nets. If a division required 2 units of fuel, 4 were scheduled. If an offensive demanded 1 reserve, 3 were allocated. Not as indulgence, but as systemic insurance. The battlefield ceased to be constrained by caution. German planners, observing from afar, began to register the shift as something increasingly ominous. It was not merely that American forces were well supplied, it was that they behaved as if supply was infinite, that confidence, visible in their maneuvers and timing, became psychological pressure. An entry in a German logistics report from late 1943 noted with evident frustration. The enemy appears unconcerned with expenditure. Their artillery fires as if shells regenerate without limit. That perception was not exaggeration. It was the natural outcome of a system built to make loss irrelevant. American troops on the ground observed their own transformation with muted amazement. Where once equipment was guarded with near reverence, now it was replaced without ceremony. Where once rations were counted with discipline, now they were issued with casual abundance. The men began to understand their role within a machine too large to be stopped by conventional interference. A sergeant stationed at a forward depot in Kent wrote, "We are told to think big, bigger than makes sense. Because sense belongs to shortages, and shortages are what we are burying. As the invasion of continental Europe began to take clearer shape in strategic discourse, the supply system responded automatically. It did not wait for beaches to be selected. It prepared for every possible shoreline. Instead of asking where the army would land, it asked how much could be delivered if any shoreline was chosen. Beaches became variables. Supplies became constants. The logic was elegant in its brutish simplicity. Load the ocean with enough steel, fuel, and ammunition that no landing could fail through deprivation. The gamble no longer focused on victory. It focused on certainty that defeat could not occur through lack of resources. In this, Somervell's vision hardened into unassailable reality. The warnings of early critics faded. The whispers of doubt vanished. A silent consensus emerged that the war was no longer governed by equilibrium, but by accumulation. The Americans had discovered that time, when fed by industrial abundance, became a weapon as potent as any division. And still, the avalanche gathered mass. Training grounds in Britain transformed to accommodate the constant inflow. Engineers constructed new storage complexes that resembled cities without citizens. Each building bore precise markings, each crate bar-coded for rapid routing. The scale defied intuition. One observer remarked that if the war ended tomorrow, Britain could fight another entirely on the supplies already landed. Germany, constrained by scarcity and precision, continued to measure logistics as an extension of tactics. They struggled to adapt to an opponent who treated logistics as a battlefield before the battlefield itself existed. The result was inevitable. When American strategists ran simulations, they no longer asked whether an offensive could be sustained. They asked how quickly it could be accelerated. The existence of supply ceased to be questioned. Only the speed of its conversion into operational power remained. In this environment, the first whispers began to circulate through Allied commands. Once we begin, we will not stop. It was not arrogance. It was mechanical truth. The gamble, once derided as reckless extravagance, now muted all dissent. It could no longer be reversed. To halt it would require dismantling not just policy, but the momentum of an entire industrial civilization in motion. And so Somervell's casino ceased to resemble dice at all. It was no longer a game. It was a system designed to ensure that when the final moment came, uncertainty itself would find no place to stand. The avalanche was no longer forming. It was rolling. By the time 1944 approached, the American supply machine no longer existed, merely as a background mechanism. It had become a visible presence, a steel geography etched across the English countryside and now poised to spill onto the shores of continental Europe. The gamble that began as theory now stood heavy with tangible consequence. The sky above the Channel no longer carried only aircraft, it carried prediction. This was the phase where inevitability sought contact. Every dock, every pier, every stretch of coastline bristled with preparation. Artificial harbours rose from drafted blueprints and sunk concrete as though conjured by industrial will alone. Floating piers, interchangeable causeways, and portable unloading systems waited for their appointed moment. The plan was not simply to land men. It was to land a supply universe behind them. The American planners had calculated an invasion not as a singular event, but as a permanent umbilical tether to abundance. From the first soldier ashore to the last vehicle rolling inland, the doctrine dictated a singular truth. Movement must never exceed resupply. If men advanced, fuel followed. If artillery fired, shells replaced themselves. If vehicles broke, others arrived without delay. The battlefield was framed not by geography, but throughput. Somervell's earlier critics found their voices almost irrelevant now. The supply system had become too large, too interwoven, too dominant to oppose. It dictated tempo. Commanders planned based on its rhythm. Even strategic decisions bowed subtly to its capacity. The New York ports, once seen as overcrowded liabilities, now represented a marvel of controlled excess. Ship manifests ran into volumes thicker than tactical field manuals. Every crate was tracked, every movement plotted, every congestion point anticipated. The planners no longer fought to prevent backlog. They permitted it as a cushion against unpredictability. The gamble matured into certainty. A British colonel touring a supply hub near Exeter turned to an American officer, said, half in awe and half in alarm, "You Americans do not appear to fear the unknown." The reply was simple: "We bury it." As the date for the continental landing approached, an invisible tension built, not on the front lines, but within the arteries of the logistical network itself. Every system hummed at maximum tolerance. Rail lines carried more weight than design specifications allowed. Storage platforms expanded outward with geometric efficiency. Movement never ceased. Silence became suspicious. American soldiers arriving in England began to notice the paradox. On one hand, they witnessed occasional chaos, misplaced crates, overcrowded trucks, clerks overwhelmed by paper storms. On the other, they never lacked anything essential. Their rifles were clean, their vehicles fueled, their rations plentiful. The proximity of disorder never compromised delivery. It was not perfection, it was dominance over imperfection. German intelligence, watching mass movement across the Channel, issued increasingly desperate reports. They observed the scale but still failed to comprehend it. Their assessments acknowledged volume but underestimated continuity. They believed disruption could cripple it. They did not grasp the resilience embedded in surplus. A memorandum intercepted from German command asserted, "The enemy supply chain is vulnerable through concentrated interruption." It was a logical assumption. It was also catastrophically wrong. When the first American boots pressed into continental sand, they were followed almost instantly by a tide of materiel that defied historical precedent. Not days later, not weeks later, but hours. The mathematical gamble became physical reality. Floating docks functioned with mechanical elegance. Vehicles rolled down ramps directly from the sea. Fuel flowed through laid pipelines as naturally as water through soil. The supply chain did not pause to admire the landing. It advanced as though rehearsing a ritual long, scripted. And still, critics whispered. They pointed to inefficiencies. They noted occasional duplication. They highlighted instances of misrouted shipments. Yet these complaints sounded hollow against the overwhelming truth unfolding before their eyes. The Americans were not supplying an invasion force. They were supplying momentum. From the moment sea met shore, the advance ceased to be reactive. It became pre-planned pressure. Every mile forward was already provisioned months before. Truck convoys rolled inland in endless succession, their drivers measuring progress not in distance, but in rhythm. The battlefield, once shaped by artillery and terrain, now aligned increasingly to the schedule of resupply. Units did not halt for fuel. Fuel anticipated them. Medical services did not wait for transport. Transport overwhelmed need. The entire experience of warfare shifted, as if gravity itself had been redefined. A young logistics officer, watching trucks roll inland, remarked to his senior, "If they do not stop, nothing can stop them." The senior did not contradict him. What Somervell had originally proposed as abstraction now manifested as unstoppable motion across a foreign continent. The gamble had transformed terrain into commodity, distance into scheduling, resistance into friction measured only in time. And the time favored those who no longer feared shortage. Behind the men advancing through hedgerows and fields, the silent arithmetic of abundance continued to operate. Each shell fired triggered unseen replacement. Each gallon burned summoned unseen stores. Each tire worn produced another before the rubber cooled. The supply system behaved like something alive, responding, adapting, anticipating. It no longer asked permission. It moved because it had been built to move. Where previous wars had been exhausted by depletion, this one pressed forward by reinforcement. The more it advanced, the more it strengthened. Every step inland increased throughput, rather than strain. Supply points duplicated. Lines multiplied. Reserves expanded. This was no longer war in the traditional sense. It was a contest between appetite and infinity. The Americans had chosen to gamble that factories could outrun destruction. They were winning. And as the avalanche of matériel continued to sweep over the European landscape, the realization began to dawn even among the most skeptical observers. This was not temporary excess. This was permanent imbalance. The gamble had paid. And now the house itself moved forward across Europe, brick by brick, ton by ton, mile by mile, until even resistance began to feel like subtraction from an equation already solved. By late summer of 1944, the American advance across France had shifted from daring maneuver to mechanical inevitability. Paris had fallen, German resistance fractured, and yet the greatest threat to victory was no longer the enemy, it was distance. The armies surged forward faster than any supply doctrine had ever anticipated. The gamble now faced its ultimate test. Could abundance move as rapidly as ambition? The answer came not through heroics, but through wheels. They called it the Red Ball Express. A name that sounded almost whimsical, as though it belonged to an amusement railway rather than the principal artery of modern warfare. Yet this convoy system, born of desperation and ruthless efficiency, would become the moving spine of Somervell's doctrine. Thousands of trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, formed a ceaseless mechanical procession stretching from the ports of Normandy to the forward spearheads racing toward Germany. The rules were simple. No civilians, no deviation. Red circles marked priority routes. Everything moved forward. Everything. Drivers slept in minutes, ate while engines idled, hands blistered around steering wheels that vibrated heat into their bones. Each truck carried its own slice of effort, inevitability. Ammunition crates, fuel drummed like blood, spare parts, radios, bridge sections, rations, medical supplies. Every mile forward was calibrated not only by the boots of riflemen, but by the rubber of tires. By September of 1944, the Red Ball Express operated with brutal precision. It moved more than 12,000 tons of supplies each day and night, through rain, dust, blackout, and bombardment. The convoy rolled. It did not stop because stopping would mean collapse. A truck driver from Louisiana later described the reality with stark clarity. We were not hauling supplies, we were hauling time. Time that German units no longer possessed. The scale horrified observers. From hilltops, one could watch the unending line of trucks disappear beyond the horizon, like a metallic river flowing toward conquest. The noise never ceased. Engines growled, gears screamed, tires hissed against broken French roads worn to powder beneath the strain. To the German soldier retreating eastward, the sight was incomprehensible. They did not face a pursuing army. They faced rolling infrastructure. Each passing convoy disproved the possibility of American exhaustion, and within that motion lay brutal mathematics. German intelligence estimated their own fuel deliveries at fractions of what the Americans consumed simply in movement. The difference was not in bravery, it was in capacity. A captured German logistics officer wrote in his interrogation, "They do not transport supplies to sustain war, they transport supplies to erase resistance." The American gamble had now fully mutated into certainty. The supply chain was not reacting to terrain, it was redefining it. Roads became arteries. Towns became waypoints. Entire regions functioned as temporary nodes within a living machine. The more the army advanced, the more the supply system expanded behind it, leaving no vacuum, no pause, no weak seam that might fracture momentum. And what had once appeared reckless became irrefutable doctrine. Troops advancing through captured French villages discovered that their boots were never worn beyond replacement, their ammunition never low beyond resupply, their fuel never rationed beyond normal operating caution. The army began to think differently. Not in terms of survival, but in terms of pressure. Pressure became the new tactic. A division commander scribbled in his journal, "We are not fighting with strategy, we are fighting with continuation." Where earlier battles had been defined by hard limits, these were defined by elasticity. The more the enemy resisted, the more logistical force accumulated in response. Every challenge summoned more trucks, more shells, more armor. It was no longer a question of, can we? Only when will it arrive? German units found themselves increasingly strangled, not by direct engagement, but by the inability to move, replenish, or retreat. Their rear lines collapsed under scarcity, while American rear lines overflowed with redundancy. The contrast turned surreal. American soldiers threw away half-eaten meals. German soldiers measured bread by grams. American trucks bypassed entire depots because they already had more than necessary. German units fought for liters of fuel with existential desperation. The imbalance cut deeper than firepower. It cut into belief. A senior German officer observed bitterly, "They fight like men who know they cannot lose." He was correct. By now, Somervell's doctrine could no longer be criticized. It was studied. It was emulated. It was absorbed into the very identity of American warfare. War ceased to be defined by tactical brilliance alone. It had become a contest of industrial continuity, and continuity favored the side that never paused. Each mile toward the Rhine merely shortened distance, not possibility. The Red Ball system adapted as new depots sprung into existence, as new ports opened, as the logistical line rolled, eastward across a broken continent. The gamble had transcended risk entirely. The supply chain no longer gambled on success, it manufactured it. And as the convoys roared across the flattened roads of Europe, their endless progression etched a final unanswerable truth into the consciousness of everyone who witnessed it. Wars were no longer won by momentary courage alone, but by the relentless insistence of abundance. The House had not merely won, the House had rewritten the rules. By the autumn of 1944, the gamble had entered its final phase. What had once been speculative doctrine now moved with the certainty of a locomotive, crushing hesitation beneath tracks forged in factories thousands of miles away. The American advance no longer resembled a campaign. It resembled mechanical progression. Every mile gained did not thin their strength, it multiplied it. German resistance hardened around fortified positions, river lines, and desperate counterattacks. Yet each act of defiance collided against a reality that could not be outlasted. Ammunition rained without pause. Vehicles roared without rest. Fuel flowed as if siphoned from an endless subterranean ocean. The battlefield had become an environment calibrated by throughput, not courage. Somervell's doctrine had stripped scarcity from the vocabulary of war. What remained was pressure, constant and irresistible. At forward command posts, officers no longer asked if they could mount an operation. They asked how many simultaneous operations could be sustained without strain. Supply officers presented figures with casual confidence. New tonnages arriving, new depots opening, new rations available before prior stocks diminished. The gamble had become surplus so complete that planning moved faster than depletion. A major within the operations section recorded a moment that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. The request exceeded our projection. We approved 3 times the amount, and still retained reserve. This was not indulgence, it was fearlessness born from demonstrated capacity. Behind the advancing infantry and armor, entire landscapes transformed into logistical ecosystems. Roads resurfaced under military necessity. Rail lines rebuilt through shellfire zones. Bridges rose within hours where others fell. The pace left little time for contemplation. The momentum itself dictated action. German observers increasingly recognized that tactical brilliance could delay but not reverse the tidal rhythm of the Allied machine. Reports from the front no longer spoke of winning engagements. They spoke of temporary containment. A divisional report captured the bleakness with brutal precision. Enemy advances appear immune to attrition. Losses are absorbed without measurable slowing. The meaning was clear. This was not an enemy whose resources dwindled with expenditure. This was an enemy whose power intensified through use. Each destroyed vehicle summoned its replacement. Each fired shell ensured another would take its place. Ammunition did not diminish. It rotated. Fuel did not evaporate. It replenished. And the soldiers knew it. American troops, once cautious and methodical, now advanced with a confidence born of certainty. They moved, knowing their rear was not fragile, but reinforced by layers upon layers of redundancy. They operated without the quiet terror that haunted armies reliant upon delicate supply threads. Instead, they marched as beneficiaries of a machine designed to eliminate the fear of running out. German resistance, in contrast, calcified under deprivation. Their guns fell silent between limited bursts. Their vehicles rationed movement. Their commanders calculated every expenditure as though cutting away years from a finite reserve of life. A captured German lieutenant confessed quietly during interrogation, "You consume more in a day than we receive in weeks. How do you fight such arithmetic?" Arithmetic was precisely the weapon. Somervell's gamble had repurposed mathematics into an existential force. The American supply chain did not simply support the front lines. It rewrote the very nature of what war meant. Instead of a balance between capability and exhaustion, it created a dynamic of acceleration versus collapse. One side advanced because it could not be exhausted. The other retreated because exhaustion had already arrived. By this stage, the illusion of German recovery evaporated. Even resolute units understood the impossibility of sustained resistance. They faced not an army but a system designed to ensure their eventual inevitability of defeat. American planners observed with quiet detachment. They took no satisfaction in the disparity. They merely adjusted timetables. Objectives shifted forward as the supply stream expanded behind them. What once required caution now required scheduling. A colonel stationed at a forward logistics node remarked with surgical honesty, "Victory is no longer tactical, it is procedural." And the procedure operated flawlessly. As the Rhine drew nearer, the supply chain intensified. More trucks filled the roads. More depots groaned under capacity. More tonnage poured into the European artery, as if gravity itself demanded it. The gamble, which had begun as philosophical rebellion against traditional restraint, now solidified into absolute doctrine. To stop would violate not logic but momentum. The machine had no mechanism for hesitation. It would move until no resistance remained. German soldiers now spoke not of enemy tactics but of enemy abundance in hushed tones. The conversations revolved around what could not be matched: shells that never ceased, fuel that never disappeared, equipment that replaced itself with chilling speed. Their warfare had become symbolic gestures against statistical certainty. American commanders felt a strange solemnity in the realization. They understood that courage alone could no longer shape outcome. It was now a subordinate element within a larger industrial convergence. This was war not as chaos, but as inevitability. The grand gamble had birthed a new doctrine of victory, one where the side willing to produce beyond rational expectation could overwhelm every conceivable variable. Somervell's vision had transcended its origin, becoming a silent force guiding the entire Western advance. There were still bullets, there were still dead, but behind it all moved a relentless procession of supplies that refused to acknowledge the very concept of limitation. And as winter pressed inward and the conflict neared its denouement, one unavoidable truth loomed above every battlefield. The gamble had not only succeeded, it had changed history's understanding of what it meant to prepare for war. The house did not falter. The house advanced, and Europe, stripped of illusion, yielded not to genius or luck, but to the irresistible current of calculated abundance. By early spring of 1945, the final shape of the gamble revealed itself across a continent stripped to its exhausted bones. The American supply system had ceased to resemble logistics. It now functioned as an occupying force of numbers, an invading architecture of certainty that advanced not by courage, but by kinetic consistency. What remained of German resistance no longer calculated victory. It calculated survival measured in hours. The supply chain had completed its philosophical transformation. It no longer reacted to warfare, it dictated it. Every movement on the map corresponded to an invisible ledger of tonnage, timing, and probability. Divisions advanced not because they desired ground, but because the machinery behind them made advance inevitable. The moment resistance appeared, pressure multiplied. The moment terrain slowed progress, infrastructure adapted. The equation always balanced in favor of expansion. German units now retreated through landscapes that could no longer support them. Bridges destroyed did not hinder American pursuit. Engineers arrived like surgeons of momentum, laying steel where stone had failed, restoring connectivity faster than destruction could remove it. Every obstacle merely delayed arrival by minutes, not weeks. The gamble that had once frightened cautious officers now dictated the tempo of an entire hemisphere. A captured German colonel observed the American columns and whispered bitterly, "We do not fight soldiers. We fight their warehouses." He spoke the truth more accurately than he realized. The battlefield had evolved into a paradox. The closer Germany came to its own geographic core, the stronger the American presence grew. The further American forces moved from their original shores, the more abundant they became. Distance, traditionally a weakening factor, now operated as amplification. This inversion stunned even seasoned strategists. A senior Allied planner recorded, almost in disbelief, "Our strength increases with every mile we travel." This was the logical conclusion of Somervell's gamble. The deeper the machine extended, the more thoroughly it secured its own continuation. Forward progress generated rear expansion. Expansion generated capacity. Capacity generated certainty. It was a closed loop of inevitability. German resistance, once fierce and orderly, now unraveled into isolated gestures. Ammunition ran low. Fuel vanished. Vehicles lay abandoned not from damage but from emptiness. Even food became a tactical concern. The contrast grew obscene. American soldiers heated meals inside vehicles, while German soldiers rationed crusts. American artillery fired rehearsed patterns of overwhelming bombardment, while German guns sat silent from scarcity. American commanders coordinated operations atop mounds of supplies, while German officers scribbled contingency plans on fading hope. The outcome no longer carried suspense, only gravity. By this stage, the supply chain had coasted, transcended strategy and entered myth. Soldiers did not merely trust it, they depended upon it with unquestioned faith. They spoke of it not as system, but as presence. "If we can see it, it will come," a rifleman remarked. He did not mean enemy, he meant supply. The final German attempts at disruption proved futile theatre. Bombing rail lines delayed shipment but activated secondary routes. Attacks on depots triggered redistribution. Destruction of convoys summoned more convoys. The enemy did not react defensively. It compensated offensively. Each attempt to create chaos strengthened the operational certainty that it could absorb chaos entirely. A German engineer officer described the experience with raw clarity. "We destroy one road, they build two." There were no longer gaps, only gradients of dominance. As Allied units approached the heart of Germany, the American supply architecture followed like shadow turned solid. Mobile depots sprang into existence. Field, distribution centers transformed ruins into nodes of continued advance. The flow never receded. It expanded. The machine had no concept of retreat. And within this overwhelming structural certainty lay the ultimate revelation. The gamble had never been merely about defeating Germany. It was about redefining modern power itself. It was a demonstration that future wars would not be decided solely by bravery or even strategy, but by which civilization could construct the most resilient channel between intention and execution. War had become industrial choreography. The final collapse came not with thunder, but with arithmetic silence. German resistance did not end from one decisive blow. It ended when no resistance could be morally sustained against such disproportion. The supply chain had bled the battlefield of illusion. One German soldier, surrendering near the Elbe, was asked why his unit no longer fought. He gestured toward the endless American columns and said simply, "This never ends." He was not referring to soldiers, he was referring to momentum. By the time formal capitulation approached, The American supply network had already begun shifting into peacetime reconfiguration, converting excess into stability, movement into occupation, war rhythm into reconstruction rhythm. The same doctrine that had fueled destruction now became the backbone of reassembly. The gamble had won not only the war, but the architecture of peace. Looking back, Somervell's original doctrine now appeared less like recklessness and more like prophetic mathematics. He had recognized that uncertainty must not be feared but buried beneath volume. He had known that hesitation would kill faster than excess, and he had been right. The supply chain had become the silent protagonist of the European conflict. It had arrived before the soldiers, advanced behind them, and sealed victory around them. Its logic had overshadowed bullets and strategy alike. In the end, history would remember the generals, the battles, the flags raised over shattered capitals. But beneath every such symbol lay the real triumph, a civilization willing to gamble on infinite preparation and a machine capable of making that gamble permanent. The house never collapsed. The house calculated. And through that calculation, the war ended not by chance, but by deliberate, unstoppable design. The gamble had become law, and law had become victory. When the guns finally fell silent and Europe stood stunned beneath the weight of its own survival, the supply machine did not stop. It merely shifted posture. The momentum that had crushed resistance now confronted a different horizon. Reconstruction, stabilization, occupation. Victory had not drained the system. It had revealed its next function. The gamble had not been designed for war alone. It had constructed a framework capable of sustaining peace with the same relentless certainty. Across Germany and the liberated territories, American convoys rolled not with shells but with structure. Food replaced ammunition, lumber replaced armor, medical supplies overtook explosives. The same arteries that had delivered destruction now carried restoration. It was an inversion without contradiction. The engine simply changed cargo. The mathematical heartbeat continued. Military warehouses transitioned into humanitarian depots. Engineers who once rebuilt bridges for tanks now rebuilt them for commerce. Rail lines reconnected cities to economies, not offensives. The doctrine of ship everything, everywhere, all the time evolved into its final form: rebuild everything, everywhere, ahead of demand. Where war had required dominance, peace demanded continuity. An American officer overseeing occupation logistics spoke with measured amazement. The system does not understand ending, it only understands movement. He was correct. The machine, centuries in the making through industrial evolution, had no lever for cessation. It redirected, redefined, repurposed, but it never paused. That absence of pause became its most revolutionary trait. German civilians, once terrorized by the thunder of advance, now watched as trucks delivered flour, medicine, clothing, and heating fuel. The same roadways that bore armored divisions now carried the infrastructure of survival. The contrast unsettled them more deeply than the invasion itself. One elderly German man, observing the transformation, murmured bitterly, "They defeat us even in mercy." He too spoke the truth. The supply doctrine had achieved something no empire before it had considered possible. It had turned logistical abundance into an ethical weapon. Not only could it conquer, it could sustain without collapse. That capability alone redefined global hierarchy. And the world noticed. In the aftermath of the conflict, military observers from every continent studied the American experiment not as anomaly, but as blueprint. Reports flooded academies. Strategists dissected figures. Politicians studied tonnage graphs and delivery schedules with the same reverence once reserved for battle maps. The lesson was unmistakable. Future power would not be defined by dramatic brilliance on the field, but by the invisible architecture behind it. The nation that could feed uncertainty faster than it could breed fear would shape the next century. Somervell, now older and greyer, reviewed the logistical reports of demobilization with quiet gravity. The same statistics that once represented ferocity now symbolized stability. The same gamble that had horrified cautious planners now underpinned post-war global order. He remained characteristically unsentimental. "We did not gamble for glory," he remarked privately. "We gambled because hesitation kills nations." The truth lingered like echo. As the world rebuilt, the supply chain's philosophy seeped into civilian life. Mass production shifted from rifles to refrigerators, from shells to housing, from rations to consumer abundance. The war machine morphed into economic engine, and its logic, redundancy, scale, preparedness became the foundation of modern prosperity. The dice had reshaped history. Years later, when historians analyzed the conflict, they often searched for singular moments, decisive engagements, turning points bathed in cinematic clarity. They searched for heroics. They catalogued brilliance. They praised valor. But the deepest truth lay elsewhere. Victory had not been determined by dramatic genius. It had been decided in spreadsheets, warehouses, assembly lines, shipping schedules, and production quotas. It had been decided by those who believed excess was not waste but armor, those who dared to build beyond prediction. The supply chain, gambling system, did not merely win a war. It altered the definition of preparation itself. It taught future generations that power lies not in perfect forecasting, but in overwhelming elasticity. That resilience is manufactured through margin, not precision. Precision had failed too often. Volume had not. Even decades later, veterans who had marched behind the rolling river of trucks would recall not only the battles, but the surreal certainty that accompanied their advance. The feeling that someone, somewhere, had already prepared tomorrow before today had fully passed. A former infantryman remembered it best. You never wondered if you'd have what you needed. You just wondered how they knew before you did. That knowledge defined the American century. And in that truth, the gamble reached its quiet conclusion. No longer as gamble, but as doctrine. No longer as risk, but as permanent philosophy. The last convoy did not mark the end. It marked the beginning of everything that followed. The house did not close. It expanded, and the world, forever changed by the mathematics of abundance, learned that wars are not merely fought by those who pull triggers, but by those who refuse to let the machine run dry.